All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of my video series, which I'm calling Design Deconstructed. Hopefully, you all got something out of the first episode and weren't too put off by some of the audio problems. I have made some adjustments to the way the microphone works and picks up volume. Hopefully, this will sound better for everyone. If there's still issues with this episode, I can look into getting a proper microphone. But I'm kind of waiting and seeing how this will go with the changes that I made. So anyway, yeah, the second episode that I'm going to do, I thought about initially moving chronologically through my content up through Heart of Thorns and then Path of Fire and on. But I felt it might be better to actually stagger things out a bit. So we're going to jump from one of my earlier Living World episodes into my most recent and ended up being my last chapter from Living World Season 4, Episode 4, Star to Guide Us. And the chapter's name was A Shattered Nation. I chose this content because I was not the sole owner of it. I actually took over from another designer who left ArenaNet, Morgan Brown, who did an excellent job of setting things up for me. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted to sort of compare and contrast the way that one would approach content that's already sort of been authored to some fair amount of degree, and how that makes different challenges for designers, because it's very different can of worms that you're opening when you're dealing with somebody else's content. Uh, yeah, as I was saying, most of it was already done. It was playable from start to finish with the major VO pieces already laid out. The script was in place. Everything was pretty much there from a gameplay standpoint. So it was really up to me to kind of take it and iterate on it and make sure that everything was solid and ready to go for ship. That is much easier said than done, however. It takes a very different mindset for one, because you spend a lot of your early time on a project like this just kind of deconstructing, which is partly why I wanted to do this episode now, is because that is very much what you do, is you deconstruct what the other designer has done and try to understand and reverse engineer some of the things that they set up, and things that don't work and things that do work for my mindset, which is different. I'm the farthest you'll get from a technical designer. I came from the art side. I used to be an environment artist, so I have a much different sort of sensibility to the way that I author content. I weight my stuff more towards a creative and narrative and cinematic approach, and I don't get heavy into serious game mechanics and super dense, crunchy boss skills and that kind of stuff. So it can create problems when I have to take somebody's content over who has that kind of mindset, which I think Morgan did. He was a much more technical and sort of stronger implementer and scripter than I was. So I had to understand the way that he built content and how I would adapt it to my style. Um, so yeah, that's kind of a standard problem that you have in game development. I think anybody who takes over anyone's art or code or any other piece of content design would have the same sort of problems. So yeah, wrapping my head around that was an interesting challenge. In particular, I will call out that the back half of this chapter, which sees the commander running through the Jahai Keep and trying to avoid Deathbrand and Shatterer. That was a very, very complicated piece of scripting work and gameplay mechanic. It's not complicated for the player. It's a very simple mechanic, but setting it all up so that it is simple for the player is part of the challenge of design work. So yeah, anyway, that's the high level of what I wanted to talk about before we get into the game. You've heard me ramble on long enough already, so we're just going to go ahead and get started, and I will fire up Shattered Nation. All right, just 1 second. All right. So we are in the game. One of the first things I'm going to call out here is that we have an open world step. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of details with this. other than to say we get to meet Bram here
There
in the
you are.
vineyard.
If we don't
He
get
talks to
Aurene
us
out
as
of
we
there soon,
approach.
Udemishi and the others are gonna start a
Bram
war.
here is using a new
Again.
tech that we got
Udamishi's
for
at the
Season 4,
summit?
which we
Yeah,
called
it's been a
visibility
weird day.
channels.
You'll see when you get there.
Basically,
Don't want to cause a
it's
panic in the city, so
a
we'll
way
use the
for us to
back way in.
have
Or the Corsair
characters
route, right
that
under
are,
Jericho's nose.
important characters, named
You
characters
can head in
in the
there
open
whenever you're
world,
ready.
which we didn't used to have the capability of doing very easily. Um, because for all intents and purposes, when we add a character to the world in Guild Wars 2, they are added to the world. So that's actually what's happening here, is that Bram is actually here all the time. The tech that we got is a visibility channel, which basically means that he is only visible to players who are on this story step or meet other very specific criteria. So that way he does not here all the time. Technically, he is here all the time, but you don't notice that he's here all the time. In other games or other MMOs, this is sometimes called phasing or instancing. Um, but for us, because it's primarily a visual trick that we're doing, we settled on the term visibility channels. It basically literally adds him to a channel that only certain players can see. Yeah, so I don't want to say too much more about that because it's pretty technical and I don't understand the code side of it. But I will say that from a design standpoint, this is one of the things that was a shift in our design philosophy. For the longest time, we considered it kind of a cheat to have uh, big named characters out in the open world, and that's one of the reasons why we didn't do it. It wasn't just purely a tech thing, although the tech was definitely a hampering factor. Um, but we never really kind of codified this in a very strong way because we had gadgets and props and environments that all changed and were visible or not visible based on certain criteria. So we were doing this, we just weren't doing it for characters. And so it never really kind of held water to me that we would have done this and made a special exception for characters like Bram or Kaith or any of the other major characters of our game. To have them in the open world had been a no for the longest time. And when we got this tech with Season 4, we started to use it and immediately saw the benefits of doing it. And so now I think you're seeing that we use this everywhere all the time. It allows us to have these characters in the open world and have actual relevant story in the open world. One of the big challenges with this is that because they are here all the time, but their visibility is filtered. It means that they can't do certain things, like they can't fight, because if Bram started aggroing on enemies here, he would aggro on enemies for everybody, and then if you were on the story step and you came here trying to look for Bram, he'd be off fighting somewhere and you might not see him. He'd still be there. So we have to put them as non-combatants. There's a lot of logic and scripting that we also have to do to make sure that all the weird edge cases of whether he's visible, whether he's not visible, are met, because there's a lot of different criteria that could be at play. In this case, Bram is pretty simple, but we've definitely done open world characters where they've had a lot of different conditions that have to be met to be visible. Um, I think there's still room for this technology to grow. I could see us potentially shifting. I keep saying we as if I still work there. Sorry, gotta get my head around that. I'm still working on that. The team at ArenaNet could still pioneer future uses of this technology and adapt it to a more robust system than what we have now. But I think that for what it is now, it's actually pretty cool. All right, so anyway, that's enough of that. Let's go jump in the instance here. All right. So I just spent a lot of time talking about Bram. I'm going to talk about Bram a little bit more here. Specifically, the way that he got set
Why
up to
is
follow,
Aurene
and I
even
hope,
in Jahai
I
in the
really
first
hope he
place?
doesn't break.
She's been all
I
over
was
a
trying
lot
to
lately.
record this earlier,
In the
and he
villages,
broke.
cleaning up the brain.
And
Impressive
yeah,
stuff.
that would be embarrassing.
Joko hit
But
Jahai
I mean,
pretty hard.
at the same time,
So I'm
this is one
guessing
of the
she
things that
swooped
happens in
in to
game
check on
development,
him.
is content that you
Seems
authored
like it took
months
a lot out
ago
of her, though.
can still
Collapsed
break
right there in the
months
summer
later
room.
without you having
Collapsed?
done anything, because
Do you
I'm
think
no
it's
longer
because of
working
me?
there. So
Joko
obviously I
would
haven't
give
touched
anybody
this in
indigestion,
at least 3
but
months.
maybe she's
And
just trying to do
really,
too
I haven't really
much.
touched it since it shipped.
She needs to
But
pace
basically,
herself.
the
We've
idea
still
here
got
was that Bram is
Krakatorik to
supposed
deal
to
with.
wait for you
About
if you
that,
slow down or
the
stop.
time you wanted an
He's
update on things.
supposed to get
We can't
off a
raise
mount
Cass and
if you
Joey
get
on the
off the
call.
mount,
She's starting to worry.
and get back
I'm
on if you
sure
get
they're
back on,
okay.
so that way he can
Keep trying. Let me know as soon as you reach them.
keep pace with you, basically. The idea here was that I was trying to make this an NPC that truly felt like he was walking with you and not just moving on a path towards a goal, or sticking close to you on a follow, basically like leashed to you, because that would have been annoying. I find that annoying a lot of the time, and it also creates this weird rubber banding, which you've probably seen in game, where sometimes the NPC will run over here and then realize, oh, I'm too far from my master. I gotta run back to the, and so he'll like rubber band and bounce back and forth, trying to maintain a certain distance from you. I wanted to avoid that here because it really looks bad on a mount, because they move a lot faster on a mount, and so that rubber banding is even more. So I think it's pretty successful. Again, you can choose mounted or not mounted, and Bram will try to respect that. I think that the complexity of the way that scripting is probably what's causing it to sometimes break. So if I had this to do over, I probably would have been a little bit more robust scripting on him. But it is what it is. It shipped the way that it was, and I think the bug that I ran into yesterday was a pretty rare bug. So I'm not too worried about it, and I can't do anything about it anymore anyway. It's somebody else's problem. Hey, congratulations, whoever inherits this kind of content. Yeah, so I don't think there's any. Oh, a couple things about the content out here that I just want to call out. There's a conversation over here with this
I
free
know it's
awakened
stupid, but
caster.
I can't shake the nerves.
You could
It's
probably
just,
hear in his
it's
voice,
so
if I
long
keep
since
my
I've been
voice
a
lower,
person.
that
You'll be
he
fine. Listen,
is Bram's voice
your
actor.
descendants
Yeah,
are gonna love
this is
you.
one of those cases where unfortunately a character actor wasn't available for this role, and so Sam also plays some other roles, and he got cast in this role. Uh, Ideally, we would try to avoid that. Every once in a while, we don't track every single scene and every single actor, and so that's just something that happens sometimes. It actually used to play outside of the keep, kind of over here, back out in this courtyard, and we moved it in from there because, as bad as that was, it was even more. Uh, it was even. I can't speak this morning. I'm sorry. It was called attention to more by the fact that you were riding by him with Bram, and so it sounded like Bram ended up behind you, speaking, even though it had awakened processing on it. It still was a weird situation. So we moved him inside and made it one of these player triggered conversations so that it was less egregious of an error on our part, because we're not perfect, we make mistakes. That was one of our mistakes, so we did the best we could to address it. The other option would have been to just remove that conversation altogether, but we kind of liked it, so we kept it, and I just moved it in here. And then the other part I was going to bring up is there is a lot of NPCs in here. For story instance, we usually don't try to pack, well, let's say we usually don't. We wanted to have a fairly large crowd here, but anytime you have a large crowd here, it does create performance hits, because you have a lot of different characters, a lot of different looks here in particular, because we have
His death.
4 different factions basically who are all coming together to talk in this summit, and so you've got a lot of different models that are getting loaded in, a lot of different textures that are getting loaded in, and so it creates a little bit of bloat on memory, video memory, and CPU as well. So one of the things that I did to address that is, I won't show you probably because I don't think I'll catch it in time, but once you enter the summit and you go into this area and it closes off the instance boundaries,
Clearly, it's
right
acquired a
about
taste for
here.
Thanks to God. Commander,
I
Welcome.
despawn almost
Do
everybody
you think maybe you
except
could
for this group,
relocate your
and
dragon?
then
She won't
these
budge. I
NPCs
think
all
she
get
was waiting for you.
destroyed
Well, I'm here now.
when the
Aureen, we
full
need to
summit
leave.
starts.
Let these
So that's
people
just one
do
of
their
those
work.
little game development tricks that you have.
Not even the so-called
Sorry, I'm
commander
totally not
can
paying attention to the
control
story.
that.
That's quite all right. It's not the
Really?
point of this series. I'll get back to that in a second. Yeah. I was saying that there's just, you also have to position them strategically. So, for example, I tried to make most of them off of the main sight line so that you could more easily get rid of some of them on the edges. Because again, as the player, your focus is going to be in here on this area, and you're not going to necessarily pay attention. But if you're a player like me who runs with name plates on all the time, you'll notice that, if all of a sudden this crowd dispersed, um, and if you do look back here, you can see there's no more NPCs. So yeah, that's just one of those things that we do often to continue to keep performance up on content like this, because there's a lot of moving parts that are going to come later that are also hideously expensive on the back end, and so having to have all these characters who are no longer part of the content just kind of sitting around is bad. It's just bad. So we remove them as soon as we can possibly remove them. Let's see, what else? Yeah, so you probably noticed that we've got this little ambient scene that plays out. I had a fun time setting up these characters to have a conversation that you could sort of eavesdrop on. I didn't do that here, but you can feel free to do that when and if you play through it. It's one of those things where you don't think about spending a lot of time on that, but I actually spent quite a fair amount of time on it, including this moment here, which I'm going to show you, which is Aureen roaring, because it seems like something that should just be an easy thing to do, but this took
Aureen, let's
several
go.
iterations
This
to
is no
get right.
place for a dragon,
Basically,
and
the
you
way
know
Aureen
it.
was authored is she has a very limited set of skills
All right, now we're getting somewhere.
and animations.
I'll get her out of the
And
city.
so anytime we want to
A
do
little
something with
stroll,
Aureen to get her
or
to
maybe a
blend from
long
one
one?
thing to another, we kind of have to do some scripting
This
hacks
is
on her
not how I
to get her to
expected
do what
today
we
would
need
go.
her to do. So there where she
Since
gets
you're
the
here,
hearts over
Commander,
her head and
could you help me
raises up,
calm the delegates?
so that's
We need to get this
actually
summit back
not
on track.
doing some of the traditional things that we would do. That's getting some really crazy hacks on her using buffs and animation tones and all kinds of nuttiness that makes any of that possible. All right. Anyway, that's that. I was pretty happy with that way that turned out. But there was a lot of trials and tribulations to get that right, because she did not cooperate. I love Aureen. She's my baby. I still think of her that way because I helped give her the name. I was in early brainstorming. We were talking about her, so I feel like she's part of my um, legacy, so to speak, as a game designer. But yeah, her execution makes problems for me. All right. Speaking with the delegates, so this is one of those that was really bitch to implement. Like I said, there was at least a working version of this, but I got feedback pretty early on that they wanted this to be more open-ended and let the players choose which ambassador to speak to in what sequence, because player agency is important. And
Ambassador
so
Sienna. She
I
speaks
did
for
it
the
in
free
kind of
awakened.
a
Reawakened.
roundabout
We've
way.
shed the
I
chains
didn't
of
give the
servitude
player
for the
full
promise of a new
100%
life,
absolute
and we're
agency.
grateful
I
for
gave
the second
them
chance.
sort of
Oh, and by the way, I trust
conditional
you got
agency,
in
I guess I'll
okay.
call it.
The route was my
Basically, what
idea.
happens here
Yeah,
is that
remembered it from my Corsair
you get a
days.
general step to
Thank
check in
you.
with
Again.
delegates, and then based on the player's active choice, which I consider to be if you walk over and get close to a delegate, you've made a choice. And so once you've made a choice, hey, I came over here to Kasan, so that's me choosing to speak with Kasan. If I move away, I can't undo that choice. That is one of the things that I considered doing. The reason I didn't do it that way is because in order to get that level of freedom to the player, that would have created a much bigger permutation list of different possibilities where, hey, if I go here to Kasan and then I leave and I go to Archon Ibiru and then I leave and I go back to Kasan, there's potential for breakage there that QA would have to verify does not break. That's what I was worried about. Not how much it would take for me to design this, because I could easily have found a way to do that, but I was worried for how much burden I was going to place on the QA testing group, because that's the end of the day. Like, the rubber hits the road with QA, and because they're the last line of defense before you guys get your hands on content. So I want to make sure that we respect QA's time and don't put them in a position where they have to test, 64 variants of quest step, because that's ridiculous. There's no reason why that should be. So here I lock you down into a choice. Once you move close to a delegate, you're dedicated to talking to that delegate until you're done. That way I can tick it off the list, right? And then it becomes less intensive for QA to have to worry about. So that's why I made that choice. So let me go here. I'm going to speak to all these guys. I loved setting these little vignettes up. I loved giving the player some cool little emotions, like, crossing your arms at Archon Ibiru, who's just, we all know he's the bad guy. He's making no bones about the fact that he's the bad guy. We kind of expect him to betray us. It's not a big secret. It's not a big surprise when he does it later. But the one I had the most fun with has to be, which is why I saved it for the last, Grand Vizier Udamishi. He's a character that initially I was not crazy about, but the more we've used him and the more his voice actor comes in and we get lines from him, the more I appreciate him as a character, because he's just so over the top. Straight up,
Representing
I'll let
Joko
Udamishi speak for himself.
You remember Grand Vizier
He is the
Udamishi.
quintessential
Former Grand Vizier.
awkward
Your commander saw
and
to that.
annoying,
And if you think I'm negotiating
politician.
for one more second after you send a dragon to assassinate us,
Udamishi.
If that was
just
my
gonna let him
plan,
speak.
you'd be dead already.
Leave the summit now, and your demands leave with you.
fine.
Yeah.
But I will
So
be
anyway,
treated
I
with
had a lot of
respect,
fun
or I
playing
walk.
with the acting and timing on Udamishi here to get that.
Well, that went,
I ended up having to
reasonably
split his
okay.
dialogue, because this was
If
just
you're
a
up
straight
for
up
it,
single
I'd like you to
dialogue
stay
between
for
the
the rest of
player
the summit.
Zaim and Udamishi. But I split it up into multiple dialogues because that enabled me to do all of those little quirky animations and the head, like thinking about his fate and whether or not he wants to challenge the player on this. Yeah,
Now,
I think it
delegates,
really worked
we were
well.
discussing
It's
the
one of
need
those
for a
things that's
governing
just super
council.
attention to detail.
Most Palawa
That's the kind of stuff I
Again,
love.
you
getting
assumed
into.
he's
All right, so
permanently
now we've got
dead.
the summit coming together.
They call him the Immortal King for a
Everyone's
reason,
getting together in the room.
He's not coming back this time. Aurene made sure of it.
Says the
Again, it's to help
outsider whose entire
everyone comes in
reputation
because it helps
depends
frame the
on
action,
that
because we
being the
want
case.
players to be standing right
Is
about
that why
here.
you sent that thing here?
Obviously,
To
I
flaunt
can't
your
force players
victory?
to stand anywhere,
To
but
scare us into
hopefully this
abandoning
feels
our
like the right
king?
place because you can see everybody.
Look,
Um,
Joko is gone.
stand at any angle.
We have to come together.
Eagle-eyed players will notice these Morgan
With the
Crescent
toadies
start
of the
popping
monster
in
who killed
as the
us,
summit is taking
awakened
place.
us, made us his
Again,
slaves.
This is no big surprise. We all know
As if
Archon
I
Ibiru
would
is going to
debase
betray us.
myself by
But
sharing
yeah.
a table with someone like you.
What did I tell you?
Again, I love all these actors.
Where did these
They
Morgan
do such an
Crescent come
amazing
from?
job, especially when they're all together
there
and they're
they
giving
are.
their lines.
Now we can
And,
finally begin the main event.
shout out to these guys
I was
because they are
willing
not
to
giving their
indulge
lines
this
in the same
farce.
booth
I
to
really
each other.
was.
But
once again,
and
you
yet,
had to bring your
even
dragon in.
recorded separately,
to
their
threaten
performances all
us.
come together really
You're a
nicely
danger
here.
to Alona. You
So
all are.
that's
In
definitely
fact,
on the actors.
best
It's on
thing for Alona would
voice
be for all
directors.
of you
It's
to
on
go
the folks that we
away.
send down
Guards,
to
this
make sure
land
that they
belongs
get
to the Morden
stuff.
Crescent, not to the weak, the
Now here,
ungrateful.
this is one of those
Awakened
moments when
Sunspears.
Archon
You're all
Ibiru
pathetic. And now you're done. We're taking
basically
Alona
uses
back
his
by
powers,
force.
magic on us. Seeing Koss run in was one of those moments that we really
Koss.
struggled to make sure that the
Commander.
players saw.
Good
So
to see the
we
sun
initially
again.
had the player
Anybody else
able to
got a
fight
problem with
here,
peace?
but
Go
that was
on, you
causing
can
all of
speak
the problems.
freely.
And so instead we just had
No?
him force
No
choke
one.
everybody, including the
Suit
player. He was
yourselves.
actually supposed
Now
to
then,
grab the player and pull
Field
him
Marshal
in,
Zaim has offered a
pull me
treaty.
in
Debate is over.
to right
This
about
is the
here so that
part
I
where
could see
everyone votes.
Koss
What say
slam
you?
him right up in my face. I don't know why that didn't
Under the
work. Hey, more
circumstances,
bugs.
we agree to your
So
treaty,
yes, I should
Field
report
Marshal.
that. Consider
As
this
do
my
we.
report.
From this day on, the free
So anyway,
Awakened
yeah,
are
it was a big
yours to
deal
command.
because Koss spawning in and
You are
saving the
welcome
day was
among
one of
the
those
sun
moments that
stairs,
we really
Ambassador.
wanted to call attention to,
Gods, I'm going
obviously.
to vomit.
And it's
We're
easily
not
missed
doing you
because it takes place
traitors.
over the course
We
of a few
demand
seconds,
land of our own, where we can
and
await
it's
Joko's
really
return.
not
Oh, for
in your face.
Joko's dead, and
We
Kralkator
tried a
is
number
still
of different
out there.
variants. We had Koss
You'd rather
jumping
sit on your
down from
hands than help
above
us
up
take him
here,
down?
but
What
that
about
was
your
also
dragon?
a problem
The one
because
who's
the
actually
distance there,
terrorizing
he would
Alola
like
right
pop in
now.
about
The real
so
threat isn't
about
Kralkator.
here.
It's you.
Yeah.
Commander, I finally heard from Kaz and Jory, and it's not good.
I think the
They
pulling
lost
the player
Kralkator.
in made the most
Define
sense because it fits
lost.
with his
They
abilities.
said
He
he
had that
just
ability to like force choke
vanished.
people and bring them
I
in,
think he...
and narratively that
What
worked,
was
and then
that?
also just gameplay wise, ideally when it works, it would put you right about here, and you'd be able to get a front row seat to that cinematic moment, and put you right in the action. All right, now we have the hint of the Shatterer coming in, and obviously got some audio and visual effects. There's a little Easter egg here, which hopefully you'll be able to see when I pop up here. If you look up here in the sky, you can see a packed airship going down. I added that just as another little note because when we get out to the map later, you'll see that a packed airship has gone down, and that Elmora, Sullivan, and her crew were in hot pursuit of the Shatterer. And that's not Elmora's ship because I think her ship has already crashed by this point in the story, but part of her fleet. So it's a nice little setup. It's just one of those subtle things that I think most people probably wouldn't have gotten. And it is pretty hidden because it's a very dense environment zone out there. It's hard to visualize. I wanted to add it just as a bit of continuity storytelling. Yeah. Alright. Everybody's safe. Everybody's here. Alright, this moment with the hierarch, Shakir.
You can't be
This was one of
serious.
those that
We
was
have
actually
to
really
help
tricky
them.
to get right because there's a couple different things going on here. There's actually a couple different skills that fire off. One that was supposed to kill
Guess not.
Shakir, and one that was supposed to kill
take the
players
others and
who
get them to
were
safety.
unfortunate enough to be
But my
standing
people,
here
I'll help them. Go.
when the Shatterer smashes down. I'm not going to do that. It's, get disrupted. But the funny thing is that worked for the longest time until it stopped. And to this day, I still don't know why it stopped working, where it just wouldn't kill the hierarch. And so he'd be standing here, just kind of hanging out, and invulnerable. And so what I ended up having to do for the final is, now when this paw slams down, it actually sends a signal out that Shakir reads, and he's like, oh, it's time for me to die, and then he kills himself. So yeah, that's one of those little hidden design things that,
Hold on.
you know,
I'll break the wall down.
sometimes things don't work the way you want them to work, and it takes way too long to debug, and there are plenty of other ways to do things that you decide, so you do those. It's an ugly hack. I wish I didn't have to do stuff like that sometimes, but that's the reality of game development.
I know you're
Alright,
scared,
so you
but you're
come in
strong.
here,
You can fight back.
and
Follow me and I'll get you out of here.
get more of these. You get some free awakened who you need to save from the Shatterer, who is continuing to follow you through the keep. One note about this too that's interesting potentially for people behind the scenes is that you will notice if you look at both of these, there's two Shatterers out there Shh, don't tell anybody. Yeah, this is one of those things where getting a big prop boss type character like the Shatterer to move from place to place just doesn't really work very well. They basically have a bunch of canned animations that they can do, but those canned animations don't really work in terms of motion. A lot of the time when you see prop bosses moving around, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, like this. Because we had this sort of fiery brand wall thing that was obscuring vision. If you're, if you're really looking, you can sort of see, but it's probably not super obvious that there's actually two Shatterers back there, but there are, and there will be more later. Because every one of those windows where he's sticking his paw through is another iteration of the Shatterer, which is why before when I was saying that this was an expensive instance, that's why, because you have more than one Shatterer.
I'll protect you.
Yeah, I wish that we could do a much easier time of it, but that's just how it works. Let's talk a minute about this mechanic of calling Free Awakened over to save their lives. This went through a lot of iterations in its own right as well. Initially, it was like a AoE shout around you, and so it was this big circle, so you'd have to go over to one of the Free Awakened, be in range of them, and then shout, and then they would turn into a follower and move to you, and then stop. But that created so many headaches where you would have the unintended consequences of you call them over, and then you move, and then the Shatterer comes and he smashes where you were, and then the NPCs die. And through no fault of your own, really, you have failed. And that just sucked. I mean, it sucked on so many levels because... and I say that sucked because that mechanic is one I actually made. This is the same mechanic that I used in the Path of Fire chapter where you're trying to save NPCs from the Herald of Balthazar, and she's doing these big hammer smashes, and you have to call people away from where she's going to smash that hammer. Now that worked, I think, there because you had pretty set areas. Like she moved to an area, did this big wind up, and it was pretty clear. Oh, I need to move anyone that's in this area away. And so I think that worked there. I think it works less here because the Shatterer bounces back and forth and smashes at different points, and it's not as easy to predict where you need the allied people to be. Another thing that I changed is that these NPCs used to be able to be attacked by the branded in here, the branded awakened. That also sucked because for a couple reasons. One is that these free awakened citizens are pretty weak and they died quickly. And then the other one is that the other awakened, for some reason, it wasn't narratively set up this way, but technically it ended up working this way, that the hostile awakened really hated the free awakened. They would deprioritize attacking them over attacking the player, which I didn't actually do. I didn't program them to be that way. They just kind of picked that. And I tried monkeying around with their AI for a long time to get them to not do that, and I don't know. It's one of those cases where I was questioning whether the AI was starting to gain sentience, and they actually felt betrayed by these free awakened. So in the end, I made these guys non-combatants, so that they basically just cower and hide. Not the best look for them, but they do have a narrative moment that I think pays that off, which is we'll see later in the fight with Shakir. They have a line where one of them says, "You're right. No more running. It's time to turn and fight." And so that worked really well. I think that fed into this choice that I made to make them non-combatants. But yeah, I felt really happy with the way that this ended up working, where you had to basically just kind of fish, for lack of a better word, you had to fish them over with a lure, using a ground targeted thing. I think it worked really well, all things considered. I think it made getting all 8 of them to the finish line much easier, which did impact the achievement, because the achievement is, achievements are sometimes supposedly thought of as hard. I don't necessarily think story achievements need to be hard, personally. I think story achievements can be stuff that you just wouldn't have thought of, and change the way that you might approach a challenge, but I don't necessarily think that they're very fun. I'm certainly not a fan of tying achievements all that much in my content. I try to avoid those kind of things. But yeah, this one I think helped a great deal at making saving all of these free awakened citizens possible, and I think that just gives players a good feeling. So I'm all about that. Yeah, I mean, to me, the other thing is, and this is common in games, which I continually will argue is not a good thing. Keeping NPCs alive, or requiring players to keep NPCs alive when so much of that is out of your control, just doesn't feel good. I just don't think it ever feels good. Because if they're aggroing, they're basically running an AI. You're not in control of that, and they may do something stupid because the AI is not as sophisticated as the player by far. And so they may do something, regardless of what you choose to do, that ends up killing them. And that's a really unfortunate thing.
Is the shatter gone?
And so I try to avoid that if I can. And here was
I'm
another
trying
case
to
of
get her out of here, Commander,
these
but she really
people
wants
being
to play.
non-combatants helped solve a lot of those problems for me. So.
I'll do my best.
So we are here at the
Assuming
last
shatter doesn't
of these shattered walls. Shatter comes in, scares everybody. This was a case too where this was another. This was a concession that I ended up having to make. I'm not super sold on my solution for it. So the shatter initially popped his head in, and then he used to lay down those fireballs again all over the room. And again, it didn't make sense once I made these guys non-combatants, because they were no longer threatened by that. And if I made them combatants and allowed them to be attacked here, I think it would have been a disservice to the chapter, because when he comes in and he does the fear roar, it puts these characters in positions that, again, the player does not have control over. When these NPCs are feared, they pick a random point in the room and they move to it, and as far away from the shatter as they can. Problem with that is that could move them right into the path of one of the projectiles, and that would suck, because again, the AI chose that, not the player. So I'm not super happy with this, because it does mean that this section is really quite easy. It's not, there's no challenge here. It's really just a matter of, all right, wait for the shatterer to not be in the room and then pull people through the platform, through the hallway. Yeah, it's not my greatest moment in content design history, but I actually don't mind it, because again, at this point, this is a story chapter. It's coming to an end. I kind of think of it as, this is a lighter chapter. There are much heavier chapters in this episode, which is why we were able to get away with this, I think. The Shakir fight is also not hard deliberately for that reason. I tuned this to be, very doable. The Free Awakened here, as noted, they say, "You are right, Commander, no running. We won't be chained again." So that's their indication that they are now ready to fight. They realize that their backs are up against the wall. They are not combatants, but they do their best. They come in here with punch hierarchy here a little bit to help you out. They don't do much damage. It's mostly the player who has to deal with the fight. But yeah. And then here I made them also pretty much invulnerable. So they do take damage, but they can't be killed. To again, reward the player for, hey, any of the Free Awaken that you've got to this point is a victory. we're not going to take that away from you here at the final fight. It would just be silly and punishing. One of the things that I will call out, though, is if you did lose any of the Free Awakened along the way to the Shatterer's claws, uh, smashing their heads, then they would show up here with Hierarch Shakir as a hostile NPC that you have to fight against. But they were similarly weak, so they died in a couple hits. We went back and forth on this because I initially got feedback that doing that, while it was consistent with the way that the story instance was authored before, and consistent narratively, the concern was that that would punish players for having failed before, which I agree with. Philosophically, that doesn't feel great. But I think the the worst part is if there are no consequences for your actions. And so I think that having a slight consequence of, hey, they're there to remind you that you had not gotten everyone across the finish line, in case there was any doubt about that. If you see a hostile free awaken, you know, oh crap, I missed one, because there's no real way to track that other than the achievement, and the achievement doesn't do the best job of tracking that in terms of the quantity of citizens that you've saved. So yeah, so that's why we did that there. All right, and now we're almost at the ending. Before I trigger this, I want to talk a little bit about it because this final cinematic, and it was a cinematic at one point. It was a cinematic at least before I joined the team, and then before I joined the team, the decision was made to turn this into a what we called a cin event, which is an in-game cinematic moment. It's a super important moment. It sets up a big plot point for the episode, which is that the Shatterer can now open mist portals and travel through them, which is the first hint that we have that Krakatorrik has moved into the mists. So it's a pretty powerful and impactful moment that we needed players to see. The problem was the space in here and the way that everything was set up did not make that easy. And so we went through a lot of variations of this moment. It was one of the first things I started working on when I got this, and it was one of the last things I worked on before we shipped this. I spent more time on this than any other party instance. It got to the point that we were even doing dailies and focus groups. We would do some work on it. I would iterate on this, do a version. I would record it using Fraps, or I eventually ended up setting it up so that I could easily use div commands to trigger it, so that it would teleport you here, put everybody in position, put everything in place, and then let players walk through the hall and view it. And we would literally pull people out of the hallways. We would go into our playtest review room, and anybody that was walking by, Lindsay would run out of the hall and grab them and be like, here, play this, and sit them down, especially people who had not played this chapter or this episode before. We wanted to sit them down, walk them through it, say, all you have to do is walk down the hall. And then they would play through it, and they would take a look at it, and we would watch them. We would watch their eyes. We would watch what they were watching. We would watch their screen to see what they were doing with the camera, because we really, really needed players to see this moment. And when I got it, 90% of the players that played it were not getting this moment. They were just missing it altogether, and they were like, oh, what happened? And that's terrible. We can't have that when we're trying to set up a thing. And so the simplest solution would have been for us to say, hey, I know we didn't budget for it, but we need a cinematic here so that we could force players and make sure everybody sees this moment. We took the harder road, and we butted our heads up against this until we made sure that most people see this moment. And so we used a combination of different tricks. Yeah. So I think what I learned from that process is that although a cinematic would work, I think the better result is for us to spend this time. But I think what we could have learned as a design and development team from this is that taking a cinematic and putting it in game doesn't shift it doesn't remove any burden. It simply shifts that burden down to the design team. and the other people on the team, because I ended up having to work with animation closely. I ended up working with the cinematics team because they helped get feedback on sight lines, where we want the player to be looking, right? Like that's their job. Their job is to make sure that we frame shots, that shots are framed appropriately. And so that's not necessarily a skill that a designer is going to have. So we talked to the art team. Environment art gave us changes to the space. We got adjustments on the characters and the Shatterer. We got effects work and audio work and all of it. So like it was a full team effort to make like a 10-15 second moment happen. And we probably spent, I would say, about all told 2 weeks of iteration time, back and forth. That's about how long I was on it, getting this moment right. And so that's the kind of thing that it seems like such a no-brainer and a simple, quick moment that happens at the end of the instance that you're like, oh well, it's just all there, right? Like, and it's not. It takes a lot of work to get a very small moment like this into game. We changed the animation speed, creature scaling, different audio solutions, on and on. Yeah, and so I give to you now this moment that I spent 2 weeks on. Hopefully, it shows. And I'll call out some things as you see it. So we had timing draw the player's eye by coming in this way. Then we had the shadow going this way. And then we had timing stop. And then we had Aurene rise up. And look, I missed it. See, this is how easy it was. I got talking. So, I mean, I distracted myself there. But basically, when we had Aurene rise up and fly up, we did that with a line so that she would sort of disappear right where the shadow is coming over the thing and go in. But as you can see, like that was a lot of work, and
You saw that too, right?
for 5 seconds of action, that is, as I just proved, very easy to miss if you're not paying strict attention, as I wasn't there. Yeah, that's great. It's actually too bad I don't work there anymore, because if I did, I would absolutely be able to fire up my dev commands and trigger this again so I could show it to you. Hopefully you can, if you want, you can look back at this and play it yourself, or rewind this clip and watch it and see all those things that we set up. Yeah. Anyway,
Not the first time.
the final solution for that ended up with a lot of elements
Ran into Almora and the Vigil on
to
the way
lead,
here.
your eye
It's
from one
been a
beat to
while,
the next.
Commander.
And I
We've
think
been
it works
tracking that Shatterer since
when you're actually
Krog
playing the
raised
game,
him
not
from the
like talking over it
till
like I'm
downed
doing.
our airships and then
And
vanished
yeah,
with
so
some
that's
kind
the
of
end of the instance. We
hole
have
in
this
the sky.
nice little
Sound
sort of
familiar?
character
Tears
circle
in
up.
reality itself.
I did this
How do we
because
begin to deal with this?
at ArenaNet
We
we
together
have
to face
adopted
the
Agile,
unexpected.
as a lot of development teams
We have
have,
no
and I
other
kind of wanted.
choice.
I think Morgan actually set this up, so this might even be
We'll discuss our
this might not even
options.
be my idea, so I
Following
don't
you
want
is
to take
out of the
credit for it.
question,
But I always thought of
perhaps we
this
can
as
work
this is
something
stand
out.
up, right? Like we did all this work,
So
and now
not
we're
to
having
make
our
things
stand
like
up,
way
where
worse,
everyone's going
but I'm
around
getting
and talking
crazy
about what they
readings
did for the
from
week.
outside.
So I like
things
this
have
notion
opened
that
up all over
Dragon's
Jai.
Watch
The
and the
energy
Commander's
signature
team
is
are having a
insane.
stand up
And
and
an
talking
entire
in a
village was
circle,
literally
because that's what
just
you do at
branded,
stand ups.
as in 5 minutes ago.
What in the God's
Yeah, so we're
names is
getting
going on?
the setup for the
Timey,
next chapter
take the
of
group with you to
this
find Doreen.
episode.
Bram, scout the village
But yeah,
for
that's
info.
about
I'll
it
check out
for
these rifts.
stuff that
So
I
much for
can go
peace
over
after
about
Joko.
this chapter. I don't think there was anything else that I missed, but I'm going to go through my notes real quick just to make sure
I can't
I
believe it.
didn't
Do I
overlook
know you?
anything that might be of interest. I love this moment between Kasan and Kos, who are Kos, as you know, if you're familiar,
We should
is
go
a
talk
undead
somewhere.
version of Guild Wars 1 character. And so he's meeting his descendant for the first time, and they're going to go off and have a heart-to-heart family conversation, which I thought was a neat little thing, because Kasan is obviously named for Kos, so there's a lot of weight there, emotionally and narratively. You can have optional conversations here with Almora and Ambassador Siana. I think it was pointed out before in a live stream that Udamishi runs off here and dies. That was a neat little funny moment. He wasn't actually supposed to die, I think. I'm not sure why he dies. He was supposed to just fade and go away, but yeah, that's a fun little thing if you pay attention when you play it. Um, Urumishi's great. All right, yeah, I think that's probably about it. And I don't want these to run too long, so I'm going to probably call this a day. Um, yeah, thanks again for tuning in. I'm enjoying doing these, so I'm sure I'll continue to do more and more as I go. Obviously, the first iterations of these are going to be Guild Wars 2 content because it's what I know most, and I think that's where most of you who are following me on Twitter or other places are interested in learning more about my work on Guild Wars 2. So I'm going to continue to do that first. But I'm hoping that I can turn this into a long-running series where I do some awesome deconstruction of other games and their design work. In particular, I'm playing a lot of Division 2 right now. I love their design work. Some of the things they do there, I think are things that I actually really wish Guild Wars 2 would take a look at, because I think some of the things that they're doing for their end game are phenomenal. Their end game is fantastic. I've had such a blast playing through their content. So shout out to the guys at Ubisoft and Massive for their work, because it is head and shoulders above any other like big open world shooter that I've played, and it's gotten me hooked. So I would love to talk about some of their design choices, some of their work, as well as Assassin's Creed Odyssey has some fantastic stuff that I want to dig real deep into. Recently been going through and doing a New Game Plus playthrough on that, so I might do some episodes of that. And then if I can figure it out, I have yet to figure this out. I have my PlayStation 4 plugged into my computer monitor so that I can play PS4 games there, but I have yet to succeed in getting that signal across to my streaming recording software. So I'm still working on that, but I would love to do that because I'm also playing right now through Days Gone. I think that Days Gone is problematic, but there's some interesting things that they're doing that I'd love to cover. Anyway, that's all for future episodes. I just want to say thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode. Awesome. Thank you, guys.